25 minutes to 11 here on SAFM 104 to 107, talking now about human trafficking in Africa. A big problem, huge scourge, and lots of research done on it, and really looking at the structural factors that have created a system of inequality in which the vulnerable have to fight against multiple risk factors in order to maintain the most basic level of human dignity. We're going to take calls as well on this one on 0891104207, SMSs to 34701. Some staggering figures out of the International Labour Organization. It says it's actually almost doubled its 2005 estimate, and it's revealed that there are now 20.9 million victims of trafficking in the world, and 3.7 million of them are in Africa. So we'll take those calls in conversation with Elizabeth Wilmot-Horrop, who is a freelance communications professional and project manager, writer, researcher who specializes in human rights advocacy for women and children. Elizabeth, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Siki. It's a pleasure.
Those are staggering numbers. 20.9 million globally and 3.7 million of those in Africa.
Yeah, that's right. And there are all sorts of ways that victims are trafficked and end up in situations of exploitation. So it could be trafficked into domestic servitude or sexual slavery, or it could be that people are trafficked for ritual killings, or to have their organs removed. There's a whole range. So that 20.9 million covers a whole range of reasons why people are trafficked.
What makes some countries in Africa more vulnerable to the perpetrators of this global crime?
Well, the overriding vulnerability is poverty. So one of the main themes is poverty and family breakdown. So a specific area of the population who are very highly vulnerable are orphan children or children without parental care or supervision. So, for example, street children are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, and witchcraft accusations, which is something that the paper I've written focuses on, are highly likely to lead to children being ostracised by their families and communities to end up on the street, where they're just easy pickings then to basically be sold in whichever way, either for labour, sexual servitude, etc. They're extremely vulnerable.
Let's talk about this link between human trafficking and witchcraft. How does that work?
Well, there are various ways that works. So one way that it works is in Nigeria, for example, victims of trafficking undergo something known as a juju oath, where they're basically mentally chained really to the trafficker as a result of this traditional ritual. And what that means is that they have a kind of oath of silence, an oath of commitment to the trafficker. They go into that ritual sometimes believing it's for their benefit, that they're going to be protected by the spirits as they go on their journey. Some of them know that they're going to be going overseas to work in prostitution, for example. But what happens is the level of fear that they have around retribution from the spirits if they disobey their trafficker means that they basically are coerced into a lifetime of sexual slavery. So that's one way. Another way is body parts being used in ritual killings associated with witchcraft. So, for example, albinos, children who have prized body parts, are trafficked so that they can be killed for ritual killing. So we had a case in the UK 10 years ago, the torso in the Thames of a 5-year-old boy who literally all was left of him was his torso that was found here. And investigations at the time looked into Mushi links in South Africa, but in the end the evidence pointed to a Nigerian link. So it's certainly not a problem that's solely located in Africa. So, for example, there have been cases of ritual killings in Mexico, Nepal, the UK. There was a child died last month in Malaysia as a result of an exorcism ritual. So this is a worldwide problem. It's certainly not just based in Africa, although that's the area of research that I undertook.
There's also, just staying with this juju oath and witchcraft link here, the issue of children accused of being child witches in places like Nigeria and Ghana, and the role that prophets play to who detect them, for example. Is that being investigated, the role of these prophets?
Yeah, I think the problem is that because it's so lucrative, so what you'll find is you'll get pastors, literally, their whole brand and identity is based on exercising child witches, for which they charge large amounts of money. And because there's so much finance invested in it, there's therefore also a lot of corruption, which makes it extremely difficult to investigate and prosecute. So you'll get unbelievably people, conducting these exorcisms, which are nothing short of torture rituals for children, but there's a reluctance to prosecute because these pastors are so powerful. And one key point that came out as a result of the research I did is that this is something that goes through all strata of society. So you're not talking about illiterate members of the population, you're talking about really senior figures. So one study identified for example, that there was a link between ritual killings and elections, because politicians themselves, this was in Uganda, were seeking ritual killings to try and help boost their chances in elections. Wow. So again, it's across the globe, but it's also across different strata of society as well.
Okay, so as you said, it's hard. That's what would make it even harder for authorities to deal with it, because maybe even the authorities themselves share those beliefs.
Yes, exactly. And in some countries, there's also been cases of the court system actually prosecuting people for being witches just based on testimony of people saying, yes, that person's a witch and they did this. So it's not actually based on real, what I would term sort of scientific evidence. So it's really entrenched in the system in some ways.
So when they're trafficked then out of those countries into, I suppose, other countries such as the UK or the US or somewhere else in Europe, for example, what are the difficulties faced by the law enforcers there when they do find a victim and now need to get them to testify against the perpetrators?
Yeah, that's an extremely difficult area, which really is only just beginning to be looked at. So in the article I wrote, I'd interviewed a former Scotland Yard detective, Andrew Desmond, who's now working as a consultant in anti-trafficking, and he basically has done a lot of research into juju specifically so that he can talk the language of the victims, because the problem you have is that you'll get a victim of trafficking who's come from a background of undergoing this juju ritual, which is specific to a culture within Africa. Then they're discovered in the UK, where our perceptions of spirituality are more based around traditional religion, and so they'll be in the hands of police officers who just cannot comprehend how they could have a fear of spirits that prevents them giving evidence. And so what Andrew did is basically researched juju so he could talk the language of the victims, build their trust so that they could open up to him. But that's pretty unusual. That's something that's only really just starting to happen. And really, more of that work needs to be done. So there's got to be a lot more education within receiving countries like the UK, the US, other countries in Europe about understanding where these trafficking victims have come from and why they would be so submissive and what would make them be so submissive to their traffickers. Yeah, so that's a very real issue. And also the other point to make, I just mentioned receiving countries, but it often isn't actually that clear cut. So, for example, Ireland is a major receiving but also sending country of victims. It isn't always just so clear cut that Africa's a sending country, Britain's a receiving one. It isn't actually as straightforward as that. And another point to make around that is that the definition of a trafficking victim has also recently been extended. So now, to be a trafficking victim, you don't have to be sent from Africa to the UK. You can reside even within your own community. Trafficking now is defined more by exploitation than actual physical movement. So trafficking, we're also talking about, individuals who remain even within their own country. They're possibly being sent to neighbouring countries, or they may do the extreme to go to a different continent. But again, it's quite a complex picture that's being built up here.
And just talking about the definition of trafficking now and how it's been extended, I think for many people, when they think human trafficking, they think people being sold as sex slaves. So how wide is that definition of exploitation?
Well, the definition of exploitation, so if you look at the UN protocol to prevent trafficking in persons, so this was adopted 10 years ago, so this is really a global definition of trafficking, and that talks about people being trafficked for the purposes of exploitation, where exploitation includes sexual exploitation, forced labour, slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, ritual murder. So there's a whole big list, basically. And you can also have trafficking around the issue of adoption. So a child... Another area I've looked into is where children are trafficked overseas in the name of benevolent adoption, when really they do actually have living relatives in their community. If they had social protection, those relatives would be able to afford to bring that child back into the fold, but instead the child is shoved off to an orphanage and then becomes easy prey for overseas adoption agencies who are there in the guise of wanting to find loving families for children. And although that the child may end up in a loving family, the point is they shouldn't just be plucked out of their country and sent overseas in a financial transaction. They should ideally be remaining in their community. In the financial transaction, the money should be going into that community to help them stay there, not into the hands of some adoption agency in the United States. That's a slight sidetrack issue there, but that's another area of trafficking that I've looked into as well.
Interesting. All right. We are in conversation this morning with Elizabeth Wilmot-Harrop, who is a freelance communications professional and project manager, a writer and researcher specializing in human rights advocacy for women and children. In parts of Africa, of course, witchcraft becoming increasingly linked to a modern form of slavery, and that being human trafficking. Through ritual oaths of protection, witchcraft provides a convenient way to traffic and mentally dominate victims. That's our conversation this morning. You can call us on 0891 104 207, SMSs to 34701.
Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
Talking about human trafficking this morning, some staggering statistics from the International Labour Organization. I cited them for you, showing that 20.9 million victims of trafficking all over the world, with 3.7 million being in Africa. Elizabeth, is why the big focus on Nigeria? Is that the regional trafficking hub in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, Nigeria's really given itself a focus by there's so many trafficking victims come from Nigeria. So I was at a forum of people working against trafficking in London last night, and a couple of people there who work with victims of trafficking in the UK both said that 90 to 95% of the victims that they work with are from Nigeria, and that seems to be a really common theme. And the Europol, the European police organisation, have identified Nigeria as one of the most dangerous countries in terms of organised crime, in terms of a threat to to law enforcement globally. So Nigeria is a huge problem, really. And Nigeria is also a problem in terms of trafficking into other African countries. So South Africa will have Nigerian organised criminal networks trafficking people into South Africa and then using them as drug mules from South Africa and out to other parts of the world. So Nigerians aren't only just operating within Nigeria in that context.
I mean, generally, as you say, it's criminal syndicates. They're operating all over the world. Is there a concerted effort by global bodies to deal with this?
Well, There is. The United States takes quite a proactive stance on trafficking because they produce their an annual trafficking report, and they rank kind of every country in the world according to what measures they're taking to combat trafficking. And that report's kind of used internationally. So here in the UK, we'd refer to that as well. And all the UN organisations across the board. There's not just one UN organisation like say UNICEF that looks at trafficking, but UNESCO looks at it as well. The Education, Social and Cultural Division of the UN. It's kind of threaded through lots of different programs from the United Nations at that level, and there are a lot of non-governmental organisations working in that field too. And I suppose the biggest problem is you're fighting big business. So trafficking is the second most lucrative industry in the world, along with the arms trade, second to the drugs industry. And it's obviously also related to the drugs industry. So, for example, if you can get a trafficking victim, a woman, to act as a drug mule to transport your drugs across borders, you've got two for the price of one, because you've got the drugs and you've got a sex slave all in one. And the woman, compared to the drugs which you'll sell on once, the woman you can sell time and time and time again, multiple times a day, multiple days a year for multiple years. So the kind of finances involved, and as we've looked at, compared to the risks of prosecution. So you mentioned earlier 3.7 million victims of trafficking come from Africa, and how many prosecutions were there? Well, in 2011, 257 prosecutions, 218 convictions. If you want to go into a criminal industry, which one are you going to choose?
Wow. Let's take a call from Davis in Port Elizabeth. Hi, Davis.
Hello, Jeremy Davis.
Hi, Jeremy.
I'm very concerned about the level of human trafficking in Port Elizabeth.
Jeremy, can you do me a favor? Your radio, I think,
I've
is
turned
on.
it off.
Please, thanks.
I'm very concerned about the drug distribution and human trafficking in Port Elizabeth. Apparently, we have the highest level in the country.
Really?
And what concerns me is the total lack of police enforcement to address this issue. Now, is anything being done? Are people aware of this? I go to the local police station, I talk to the brigadier there, and I get nowhere. And I'm afraid, from the information I've got, a lot of police are heavily involved in the drugs and the human trafficking.
And when you say that it's quite rife in Port Elizabeth, can you tell us what makes you say so?
Well, I can tell you, for example, that lady that was arrested at Bangkok International Airport with drugs in her dreadlocks. Yes. She was a drug mule from the Eastern Cape.
Yeah.
She came from Upper Hill Street in central Port Elizabeth, which is in my ward, and the drugs were distributed by a Nigerian named Tuku, who operates in my ward. We know his name, we know everything, but nothing gets done about it.
Oh, and when you approach the police, they just...
The police have not responded at all. In fact, I have evidence that a lot of police are also involved. I know that's a dangerous thing to say, but I have sworn affidavits regarding this matter.
Jeremy, can you stay on the line? We're going to take your contact details.
Thank you.
All right. That's Jeremy Davis in Port Elizabeth. And police enforcement. I mean, I'm not sure how au fait, Elizabeth, you are with the South African situation, but what I do know is that ahead of the 2010 FIFA World Cup, there was a big focus on human trafficking, because rightly so, with the inflows of people and the influx of people who were going to come into South Africa at the time, there was a fear that it would boost or increase the number of people trafficked in and through South Africa. And there was talk of a potential specific legislation on human trafficking.
Yeah, and here in the UK as well, there were discussions similarly around the Olympics, around increases in trafficking as well. And just picking up one of Jeremy's points about, so yes, there is corruption at the highest levels, because that's what we were talking about in terms of witchcraft accusations as well, and why aren't people prosecuted? And the other problem with law enforcement is that the trafficking victims are treated as criminals rather than victims, and that causes huge problems as well, because even if you identify a trafficking victim, if you're treating them as a criminal, your focus is then on prosecuting them, not on looking for the trafficker. So that's a huge problem here in the UK as well, and I'm sure Jeremy will, perhaps agree that also is a distraction which prevents effective law enforcement.
Oh, I just wonder about, with law enforcement and maybe potentially also training, because as you say, they will possibly either arrest the person because they found them with the drugs, and the backstory gets lost in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, that's right. And the level of coercion, just because a person is has physical freedom of movement, if they're being, firstly the juju oath issue, so if they believe there's going to be spiritual retribution and they could possibly be killed, that's always hanging over them. Yeah. But then there'll also be threats made against family members back home. I mean, quite often, interestingly, it's actually family members and neighbours who are the initial point of contact in terms of the trafficking process. So it isn't always the case that family members in this innocent. Quite often they're the initial link in the chain in getting someone trafficked. But there will be threats made against, if you don't do this, then we're basically going to kill your family at home, etc. So the level of coercion, yes, somebody's walking free through an airport with drugs in their stomach, or as breast implants or whatever, but they're not actually free in any real sense because the threat of violence and coercion over them is so enormous that they don't really have freedom at all. And that's something that's so difficult to unpick in law enforcement terms.
Let's hear from Bruce in Port Alfred. Hi, Bruce.
Yes, hi, Ziki. I was very interested to hear Jeremy's call from Port Elizabeth. I'm also from P. I've had first-hand experience in Central. And that's the main part of the older business district in P. Now, P is a city, but it's quite small. You can, at any time of the day, go into Central right now, and I'll take you down any one street, and you'll see the drug dealers freely peddling their goods right there. I just want to back up what Jeremy was saying. And the fact that there's obviously something going on at a particular level where there's lack of police enforcement. I mean, it can't be that at any time of the day, it doesn't matter whether it's the early morning, late afternoon, evening, and any number one of known drug dealers are freely operating. There must be some massive corruption in that city happening right now, and probably countrywide.
You're concerning me now, Bruce, because I'm actually going to Port Elizabeth tonight.
Please ask any of the locals what happens there in Central at any time of the day with the Nigerian drug dealers in particular. They're obviously not the only ones, but they operate freely, it would seem.
All right. Thanks, Chris. I might just take a drive through. Bye. Drive through Central tomorrow after the program. Have a look for myself and see what is happening there. Now, Chris, going back, Elizabeth, very quickly to the witchcraft issue. I mean, that's a belief system, right? So people believe this. How do you deal with that when it is an entrenched belief?
Yeah, that's a real tricky one. And I suppose what you have to acknowledge is that people have a right to belief, so they have a right to the freedom of belief, but they don't have a right to translate that belief into abuse. So, for example, here in the UK, there are churches springing up who, like I said earlier about the exorcism and the pastors in Africa. Similarly, in the UK, we've got churches who are identifying children as witches and saying they need to undergo an exorcism ritual. But what they're lobbying for here is legislation to make it illegal to identify a child as a witch, because effectively, if you're a pastor and says that child's a witch, while that you may believe that's an innocent statement, that is basically sanctioning child abuse, exorcism rituals, which are utterly horrific and can lead to the child's death. Then they're nothing short of torture, and so there has to be a correlation between believing something, stating it publicly, and that sanctioning abuse, which is often at the hands of pastors doing exorcism rituals or at the hands of the family. So in the UK, we've had cases where family members have undergone exorcism rituals with children over a period of days, leading to the child's death, all as a result of that child being identified as being a witch. And quite often it could be they're epileptic, it could be that they're sullen because they're going through a teenage phase, it could be something as simple in some communities. Even having a hangover because you've drunk too much is put down to the influence of a witch who's given you the headache. So there has to be some unpicking of the belief versus kind of common sense, really. But something that's also come out of this is it isn't a case of aren't these people stupid for believing this? Because quite often there's a very clear distinction, particularly in some countries, between traditional beliefs and the corruption of those beliefs. So an example of that is in Uganda, where you've got an epidemic of child sacrifice, when there is absolutely no cultural, traditional, historical relationship between child sacrifice. It was all animal sacrifice. So this is a modern corruption based on the finances to be earned, basically from selling children as children's organs and limbs and to be killed.
Oh, thanks for talking to us this morning, Elizabeth.
Okay, that's great. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Me too. Elizabeth Wilmot-Harrop is a freelance communications professional, also specializes in research in human rights advocacy for women and children, for women and children, for women and children, for women.